The horse begins to dig frantically on the beach. The owner calls the police when he sees what it finds. The sun shone brightly over Seaside Beach, a small coastal paradise in Southern California. Emily Parker, a 28-year-old veterinarian, rode calmly along the shoreline on her faithful companion, a beautiful bay horse named Thunder. The salty wind tousled her brown hair as she enjoyed the sense of freedom that only the sea and her horse could provide. Emily had grown up in this small coastal town and knew every corner of the beach like the back of her hand. However, this seemingly ordinary day was about to change her life forever. As she rode aimlessly, Thunder began to act strangely. The horse, usually calm and obedient, started to become restless and paw nervously. Emily, intrigued by her companion's unusual behavior, gently pulled on the reins to calm him. "What's wrong, buddy?" Emily murmured, stroking Thunder's neck. But the horse seemed increasingly agitated. Suddenly, Thunder stopped abruptly and began to dig frantically in the sand with his hooves. Emily, surprised by this action, dismounted to investigate what had caught her horse's attention so suddenly. "What have you found, Thunder?" Emily asked, kneeling beside the hole the horse was digging. As she watched her horse dig with growing curiosity, Emily noticed that something metallic was beginning to appear in the sand. Intrigued, she began to help Thunder, using her hands to push away the sand. "Hey, need any help?" shouted a male voice from a distance. Emily looked up to see a young man running towards her. He was tall, with sun-bronzed skin and messy blonde hair. He wore a wetsuit and carried a surfboard under his arm. "Yes, thank you," Emily replied, grateful for the offer of help. "My horse found something buried here and we're trying to dig it out." The young man, who introduced himself as Mike, set his surfboard aside and joined Emily in the excavation. With the additional help, they soon managed to unearth what appeared to be a medium-sized metal box, covered in rust and sand. "Wow, what do you think it is?" Mike asked, cleaning the sand off the surface of the box. Emily examined the object curiously. "I have no idea, it looks very old. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue." As they inspected the box, their fingers accidentally brushed against what appeared to be a small button on one of the sides. Suddenly there was a metallic click, and the box began to emit a rhythmic and constant sound like the ticking of a clock. What is that sound?" Emily asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mike paled. "It sounds like a countdown." Panic seized them both when they realized the possible implications. Emily looked around, noticing that the beach was full of families and tourists enjoying the sun. "We have to call the police," Emily said urgently. "If this is what we think it is, we need to evacuate the beach immediately." Mike nodded, quickly pulling his mobile phone from the pocket of his wetsuit. As he dialed the emergency number, Emily tried to calm Thunder, who was still restless and nervous. Within minutes, the sound of sirens filled the air, mixing with the roar of the waves and the cries of alarm from beachgoers who were beginning to realize something was wrong. The peaceful beach afternoon had transformed into a scene of chaos and confusion. Emily watched as police cars and emergency vehicles arrived at the beach, their blue and red lights flashing under the afternoon sun. Officers began to evacuate the area, creating a perimeter around the mysterious box. Among the crowd of blue uniforms, a man dressed in civilian clothes approached Emily and Mike. He was tall, with an athletic build, black hair, and piercing eyes. He wore a detective's badge hanging around his neck. "I'm Detective Jack Thompson," the man introduced himself. "Did you find the box?" Emily nodded, still stroking Thunder's neck to keep him calm. "Yes, my horse dug it up. When we touched it, it started making that sound." Detective Thompson looked at Thunder curiously before turning his attention back to the box. He crouched down to examine it more closely, being careful not to touch it. "The bomb squad is on the way," he informed them. "Please, I need you to move away from the area for your safety." Emily looked at Thunder with concern. "I can't leave without my horse," she said firmly. Detective Thompson looked at her for a moment as if assessing the situation. Finally, he nodded. "All right, but stay at a safe distance. I'll stay with you until the squad arrives." As they waited, Emily couldn't help but notice how Detective Thompson looked at the box with a strange expression, almost of recognition. There was something in his gaze that suggested this was more than just a case for him. The sound of the countdown continued, a constant reminder of the potential danger lurking in the sand. Emily, Mike, and Detective Thompson remained silent, watching as the bomb squad arrived and began working on the mysterious box. What had begun as a quiet day at the beach had turned into the beginning of a mystery that would change their lives forever. And as the sun began to sink into the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The bomb squad worked meticulously, their precise and calculated movements contrasting with the growing tension in the air. Emily, still beside Thunder, watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and fear. Detective Thompson remained close, his gaze alternating between the box and Emily, as if he were trying to solve two mysteries at once. Suddenly, Thunder began to grow restless again. His ears moved nervously, and his hooves stomped the sand impatiently. Emily tried to calm him, but the horse seemed increasingly agitated. "Detective," Emily called, "something's not right with Thunder. He's acting like he did before finding the box." Detective Thompson approached, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Do you think he might be sensing something else?" he asked, his voice mixed with curiosity and concern. Before Emily could respond, Thunder broke free from her grip and began galloping down the beach. Emily shouted his name, but the horse stopped a few meters away and began digging frantically in the sand, just as he had done before. "Thunder, no!" Emily shouted, running towards her horse. Detective Thompson followed close behind, signaling to some officers to accompany them. When they reached the spot where Thunder was digging, they could already see something metallic peeking out from the sand. Detective Thompson ordered the officers to cordon off the area while he and Emily approached cautiously. "It appears to be another similar object," the detective muttered, his voice tense. "Don't touch it. I'll call the bomb squad to examine it." Emily nodded, stepping back a bit while petting Thunder to calm him. "How is this possible?" she asked, more to herself than to the detective. "Two mysterious objects buried on the same beach." Detective Thompson looked at her with an indecipherable expression. "Sometimes coincidences aren't really coincidences," he said enigmatically. As they waited for the bomb squad, Emily noticed that the detective seemed increasingly restless. His eyes constantly moved between the two objects, and his right hand fidgeted nervously with an old pocket watch he carried. "Detective," Emily began, determined to satisfy her growing curiosity, "is there something you're not telling us? It seems like this affects you personally." Detective Thompson looked at her surprised, as if he didn't expect someone to notice his unease. After a moment of hesitation, he sighed deeply. "There's something about these boxes," he said quietly. "Something that seems familiar to me. But I need to be sure before I say anything more." Before Emily could press further, the bomb squad arrived to examine the second object. The tension in the air was palpable as they worked, the sound of the countdown from the first object still echoing in the distance. After what seemed like an eternity, one of the technicians approached Detective Thompson. "Sir," he said, "we've managed to open the first box. It's not a bomb." A collective sigh of relief was heard on the beach. However, Detective Thompson's expression didn't relax. "What's inside?" he asked urgently. The technician handed him a yellowed and worn envelope. "Just this, sir. And there's an inscription on the inside lid of the box." Detective Thompson took the envelope with trembling hands. When he opened it, his face visibly paled. Emily, unable to contain her curiosity, moved closer to look. Inside the envelope was an old black and white photograph. It showed a young man dressed in a military uniform, standing next to a beautiful woman in a 1940s dress. The resemblance between the man in the photo and Detective Thompson was undeniable. It's my grandfather," the detective murmured, his voice barely audible. "But this can't be. He disappeared during the war. We never knew what happened to him." Emily looked at the photo and then at the detective, feeling they were on the verge of an important discovery. "What does the inscription on the box say?" she asked softly. Detective Thompson blinked as if coming out of a trance and turned to the technician. "Show me," he ordered. The technician guided them to the open box. On the inside of the lid, engraved in the metal, were words in English. "For Jack, my grandson. The truth lies where the sea kisses the land. The past and future meet in the sand. Guard this secret well." Detective Thompson read the words aloud, his voice trembling slightly. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. The mystery was deepening, and she had the feeling they were barely scratching the surface of something much bigger. "Detective," Emily said, putting a hand on his shoulder, "what does all this mean?" Before he could answer, a shout was heard from where the second object was. They all turned to see a technician from the bomb squad running towards them, his face a mask of astonishment and confusion. "Sir," the technician shouted, "the second object, it's identical to the first one. Same inscription, same type of envelope inside." Detective Thompson stood still for a moment, processing the information. Then, with renewed determination in his eyes, he turned to Emily. "Ms. Parker," he said, his voice firm, "I believe you and your horse have just unearthed a mystery that has been waiting decades to be discovered. And I have a feeling this is just the beginning." Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. As the sun set on the horizon, tinting the sky an intense red, she couldn't help but think that Detective Thompson was right. This was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that could change not only their lives, but perhaps the very history of Seaside Beach. Night had fallen over Seaside Beach, but the beach was still a hive of activity. The lights of emergency vehicles flickered in the darkness, casting dancing shadows on the sand. Emily, Detective Thompson, and Mike remained near the cordoned-off area, watching as technicians continued their meticulous examination of the mysterious boxes. Emily absent-mindedly stroked Thunder's neck, her mind whirling with the revelations of the past few hours. Detective Thompson was a few steps away, speaking quietly on his mobile phone, his expression a mixture of confusion and determination. "I can't believe all this is happening," Mike muttered, breaking the silence. "Today was supposed to be a normal day of surfing." Emily nodded, sharing the sentiment. "Life has a strange way of surprising us," she replied, "but I have a feeling this is just the tip of the iceberg." At that moment, Detective Thompson finished his call and approached them. "I've spoken with my superior," he said. "They want us to take the boxes and their contents to the station for more detailed analysis." "What about the inscription?" Emily asked. "The one that mentions your grandfather?" Detective Thompson frowned. "That's the most intriguing part. My grandfather disappeared during World War II. We never knew exactly what happened to him. Finding this box with a message addressed to me, it's disconcerting to say the least." Emily was about to ask another question when a commotion near the waterline caught her attention. An elderly woman, wrapped in a colorful shawl, was limping towards them, ignoring the officer's attempts to stop her. "Stop!" the old woman shouted with a surprisingly strong voice for her age. "I must not touch those boxes. It's the cursed treasure." Detective Thompson gestured to the officers to let the woman pass. He approached her cautiously, followed closely by Emily and Mike. "Ma'am, who are you?" the detective asked. "What do you know about these boxes?" The old woman looked around with bright, nervous eyes before answering. "My name is Mrs. Abigail Wilson. I've lived in Seaside Beach all my life, and I know its secrets better than anyone." Emily stepped forward, intrigued. "What do you mean by cursed treasure?" Mrs. Wilson stared at her intently. "Those boxes," she said, pointing with a trembling finger, "are part of a local legend. It's said they contain a secret so powerful it can change the course of history. But it's also said that those who try to unravel the mystery are never the same again." A chill ran down Emily's spine. Even Thunder seemed to grow restless, snorting softly. Detective Thompson, however, seemed skeptical. "How do you know all this, ma'am?" The old woman smiled enigmatically. "Because my father was one of those who helped bury those boxes more than 70 years ago. He told me the story on his deathbed, warning me to never allow them to be unearthed." A silence fell over the group as they processed this information. Detective Thompson was the first to break it. "Did your father tell you anything else? Who else was involved?" Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "My father didn't want to reveal more. He said it was for my own safety. But he did mention that the boxes were connected to something called Operation Silver." Detective Thompson visibly paled upon hearing that name. Emily noticed and asked, "What is Operation Silver?" It was a secret operation during World War II, the detective responded with a tense voice. "It was rumored to involve espionage and advanced technology. My grandfather. It's believed he was involved in it before he disappeared." The revelation fell like a bomb among those present. Emily looked at Thunder, who seemed more agitated than ever, as if he could sense the tension in the air. "Detective," Emily said, putting a hand on his shoulder, "I think your grandfather left these boxes for you. Maybe he wanted you to discover the truth about what happened." Detective Thompson nodded slowly. "It's possible. But if what Mrs. Wilson says is true, unraveling this mystery could be dangerous. Mike, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. But we can't just ignore it, right? If there's a secret that could change history, don't we have a responsibility to uncover it? Mrs. Wilson looked at them all with a somber expression. I warn you, young ones, some secrets are buried for a reason. Think carefully before opening that Pandora's box. Detective Thompson looked at the boxes, then at Emily and Thunder, and finally at Mrs. Wilson. He took a deep breath before speaking. We have to investigate this, he said firmly. If my grandfather is involved, I need to know the truth, but we'll do it with caution. Emily nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and apprehension. I'm with you, Detective. Something tells me Thunder and I are meant to be part of this. As the group prepared to take the boxes to a secure location, Emily couldn't help but notice how Thunder remained restless, as if he could sense they were on the edge of something big and potentially dangerous. Night had fallen completely over Seaside Beach, but for Emily, Detective Thompson, and the others, it was as if a new day was dawning, one full of mysteries to solve and secrets to uncover. What had begun as a simple ride on the beach had turned into the beginning of an adventure that promised to change their lives forever. The following days were a whirlwind of activity for Emily. Detective Thompson had included her in the investigation, recognizing that Thunder's instinct could be valuable in unraveling the mystery. The police station had become her second home, spending hours examining the contents of the boxes and searching for clues in old files. One morning, as Emily was reviewing some documents, Detective Thompson rushed into the evidence room, his eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and concern. Emily, he said, his voice full of urgency. I found something. She looked up from the papers, intrigued. What is it? The detective placed an old map on the table. It's a map of Seaside Beach from the 1940s. Look at this. He pointed to a spot on the map marked with a strange symbol. Emily leaned in to get a better look. The symbol appeared to be a 5-pointed star with a circle in the center. What does it mean? She asked. I'm not sure, the detective replied, but it's in the same location where we found the boxes, and look at this. He pulled a photo from his pocket. It was the same photo they had found in the first box, the one showing his grandfather. On the back of the photo, there's an identical symbol. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. This can't be a coincidence, she murmured. No, it's not, the detective agreed. And there's more. I managed to contact an old friend of my grandfather's, a man named Robert Jenkins. He lives on the outskirts of town and says he has information about Operation Silver. Emily stood up, excited. When can we go see him? Right now, the detective replied. But we must be cautious. If what Mrs. Wilson said is true, we could be getting into something dangerous. As they prepared to leave, Emily couldn't help but think about Thunder. Detective, she said, do you mind if we stop by the stable first? I have a feeling we should bring Thunder with us. Detective Thompson looked at her curiously but nodded. Your horse has proven to have a sixth sense for these things. It could be useful. An hour later, Emily and Detective Thompson found themselves on a rural road, with Thunder trotting alongside them. The horse seemed restless, his ears constantly moving as if listening to something the humans couldn't perceive. Finally, they arrived at a small country house. An older man, frail-looking but with sharp eyes, was waiting for them on the porch. Robert Jenkins, the old man introduced himself, shaking the detective's hand. Jack, you're the spitting image of your grandfather. They entered the house with Thunder grazing nearby, always alert. Robert led them to a room full of old books and papers. Your grandfather and I were part of Operation Silver, Robert began, his voice laden with memories. It was a secret operation to develop advanced technology during the war. But we discovered something we shouldn't have. Emily and the detective listened intently, their hearts beating rapidly. What did you discover? The detective asked. Robert looked nervously around before answering. An artifact, something that wasn't from this world. It had the power to change the course of the war, maybe of history itself. Emily gasped. The boxes we found? Robert nodded. They contain clues to find the artifact. Your grandfather and I hid it, dividing the clues to keep it safe. But there are others who seek it, dangerous people who would do anything to obtain it. Suddenly, a sharp whinny was heard from outside. Thunder was restless, stomping the ground with his hooves. Detective Thompson stood up. Someone's coming, he said, his hand instinctively moving towards his weapon. Robert paled. "You must leave now. Take this." He handed them an old diary. "It contains more information about Operation Silver. Find the artifact before they do." Emily and the detective hurried out of the house. Thunder was waiting for them, clearly agitated. In the distance, they could see vehicle lights approaching. "Quick!" shouted the detective. "Ride Thunder and go, I'll distract them." "I can't leave you," Emily protested. "You have to," the detective insisted. "You're the only one who can decipher this with Thunder's help. I'll meet you at the beach where it all began. Now go!" With her heart racing, Emily mounted Thunder and galloped into the darkness of the nearby forest. As she rode away, she could hear the sound of cars braking and voices shouting. As Thunder carried her through the night, Emily clutched the diary to her chest, knowing it contained secrets that could change everything. The mystery was deepening, and now it was clear that they were not only unearthing the past, but also in a race against an unknown enemy. The adventure that had begun on the beach had now turned into something much bigger and more dangerous. And Emily knew that somehow she and Thunder were at the center of it all. Dawn found Emily exhausted but alert, hidden in a small cave near the beach where everything had started. Thunder grazed calmly nearby, his presence comforting amidst the growing tension. Emily took out the diary Robert had given them and began to flip through it with trembling hands. The pages were filled with cryptic notes, strange diagrams, and what appeared to be coordinates. But what caught her attention most was a sketch of the mysterious artifact mentioned by Robert. It was a sphere, no larger than a fist, covered with symbols that looked like nothing Emily had ever seen before. Below the drawing was a note: "The heart of silver, the key to changing destiny." "What are you really?" Emily murmured, tracing the outline of the drawing with her finger. A soft neigh from Thunder pulled her from her thoughts. The horse was staring intently towards the beach, his ears erect in alert. Emily stood up, carefully tucking the diary into her backpack. "What's wrong, buddy?" she whispered, approaching Thunder. That's when she saw it. A solitary figure was walking on the beach, his silhouette outlined against the rising sun. Emily's heart skipped a beat when she recognized Detective Thompson. Quickly, she mounted Thunder and rode towards the beach. The detective turned at the sound of hooves, a mixture of relief and concern on his face. "Emily," he said as she approached, "thank God you're safe." "What happened last night?" Emily asked, dismounting. "Who were those people?" Detective Thompson looked around before answering, his voice low and tense. "A group that calls themselves the Guardians of the Past. They've been searching for the artifact for decades. Last night they almost caught me, but I managed to escape." Emily felt a chill. "What do they want with the artifact?" "Power," the detective answered simply. "They believe it can alter reality itself. In the wrong hands, it could be catastrophic." Emily nodded, processing the information. "The diary Robert gave us," she said, pulling it out of her backpack. "It's full of clues, but many of them are cryptic." Detective Thompson took the diary and examined it quickly. "This is incredible," he murmured. "My grandfather mentioned this diary, but I never believed it actually existed." As they talked, Thunder began to grow restless again. The horse pawed at the sand and snorted, as if trying to tell them something. "I think Thunder is trying to show us something," Emily said, stroking the horse's neck to calm him. They followed Thunder as he walked along the beach, stopping occasionally to dig in the sand. Suddenly, the horse stopped and began to dig with more intensity. Emily and the detective knelt beside Thunder, helping him excavate. Soon, their fingers touched something hard and cold. "It's another box," Emily gasped, as they unearthed an object similar to the boxes found earlier. Detective Thompson examined the box carefully. "It has the same symbol we saw on the map and in the photo," he said, pointing to the 5-pointed star with a circle in the center engraved on the lid. With trembling hands, they opened the box. Inside, they found a small metallic device no larger than a pocket watch, with a dark screen and several buttons. "What is this?" Emily asked, carefully taking the object. Detective Thompson frowned, studying the device. "It looks like some kind of advanced technology, but not like anything I've seen before." Suddenly, Thunder neighed loudly, his eyes fixed on something behind them. Emily and the detective turned quickly to see a group of people approaching on the beach. They were dressed in black and moved with clear purpose. "It's them," the detective whispered. "The Guardians of the Past. We have to go now." Without losing a second, Emily tucked the device into her backpack and mounted Thunder. Detective Thompson climbed up behind her, and the horse set off at a swift gallop along the shore. "Where are we going?" Emily shouted over the noise of the wind and waves. "To the old lighthouse," the detective responded. "It's a good place to hide and think about our next move." As they rowed, Emily couldn't help but look back. The guardians of the past had reached the spot where they were moments before and seemed to be examining the sand. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the abandoned lighthouse. It was an imposing structure, though somewhat deteriorated by time and the elements. They quickly led Thunder to a small nearby shed and then hurried into the lighthouse. Once inside, Detective Thompson closed the door and began to block it with old furniture they found there. "This will give us some time," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Now let's see exactly what we've found." Emily took the device from her backpack and placed it on a dusty table. In the dim light filtering through the dirty windows, the object seemed even more mysterious. "Do you think this has something to do with the artifact Robert mentioned?" Emily asked. The detective nodded slowly. "It could be some kind of locator or key. My grandfather once mentioned that the artifact was protected by a series of security mechanisms." Emily took the diary and began to flip through it again. "Look," she said, pointing to a page. "There's a diagram here that looks a lot like this device." Together, they studied the diagram and the device, trying to decipher how it worked. After several attempts, they managed to activate the screen. A series of numbers and symbols began to flash. "They look like coordinates," the detective murmured, "but they're encoded somehow." Emily frowned, concentrating. "Wait a moment," she said, taking the diary again. "There's a series of equations here that could be the key to decoding them." As they worked on deciphering the code, a noise outside alerted them. Thunder neighed, and voices could be heard approaching. "They've found us," the detective said, his voice tense. "We have to get out of here." Emily looked around, searching for a way out. Her eyes fell on a ladder leading to the top of the lighthouse. "There!" she exclaimed. Quickly, they tucked away the device and the diary and began to climb the stairs. The sound of the door being forced resonated from below. When they reached the top of the lighthouse, the ocean wind hit them hard. The view of the coast stretched in all directions, but it also left them exposed. "Now what?" Emily asked, her heart beating hard. Detective Thompson looked around desperately. His eyes lit up when he saw something in the distance. "Look," he said, pointing towards the sea. "There's a small island not far from here. If we could get there." Emily followed his gaze and nodded. "But how? We don't have a boat." At that moment, footsteps were heard coming up the stairs. The detective looked at Emily with determination. "We'll have to swim." Without thinking twice, Emily took the device and the diary from her backpack and put them in a plastic bag she found in a corner. "Ready," she said. "This will keep them dry." The detective nodded, and together they approached the edge of the lighthouse platform. Below, waves crashed against the rocks, but beyond, the sea seemed calm enough to swim. "On the count of 3, said the detective. 1, 2. Before he could say 3, the platform door burst open. The guardians of the past emerged, their faces a mixture of triumph and fury. 3! Emily shouted, and they both jumped into the void just as their pursuers lunged at them. The cold water enveloped them, stealing their breath for a moment. When they surfaced, they could hear shouts of frustration from atop the lighthouse. "Swim!" shouted Detective Thompson. "Towards the island!" As they swam with all their strength towards the small island in the distance, Emily couldn't help but think about Thunder, hoping her faithful companion would be safe. She also wondered what other secrets and dangers awaited them in their search for the mysterious artifact. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, tinting the sky with shades of orange and red as the two swimmers moved away from the coast, carrying with them the keys to a mystery that could change the course of history. Exhaustion was taking over Emily and Detective Thompson as they swam towards the small island. The waves, though not huge, made their progress difficult. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, their feet touched the bottom and they managed to drag themselves onto the shore. Panting and shivering from the cold, they collapsed on the sand. Emily pulled the plastic bag from her soaked shirt, relieved to see that the device and diary were dry. "Are you okay?" the detective asked between labored breaths. Emily nodded, too exhausted to speak. After a few minutes of rest, they sat up and observed the distant coast. The lighthouse was barely visible in the growing darkness. "Looks like we lost them," Emily said finally. Detective Thompson nodded. For now, but they won't take long to search here. We need to move. They made their way into the small island, which was covered in dense tropical vegetation. As they advanced, Emily noticed something strange. "Detective," she whispered, "don't you think these trees are too orderly?" The detective stopped and looked around. She was right. The trees seemed to be planted in a specific pattern. "This isn't natural," he muttered. "Someone designed this place." They continued advancing cautiously until they reached a clearing. In the center was a circular stone structure, similar to an ancient altar. And in the center of that structure, "It can't be," Emily gasped. There, glowing faintly under the moonlight, was a metallic sphere the size of a fist. It was identical to the sketch in Robert's diary. "The heart of silver," Detective Thompson said in awe. "We found it." They approached slowly, almost reverently. The sphere was covered with strange symbols that seemed to change and move as they looked at it. Emily took out the device they had found on the beach. "I think this is some kind of key," she said, examining both objects. Before they could do anything else, a voice resonated in the clearing. "Impressive, isn't it?" They turned quickly to see an older man emerging from the shadows. He wore an elegant suit incongruous with the jungle setting. "My name is Victor Blackwood," the man said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And you've just made my job much easier." Detective Thompson stood protectively in front of Emily. "You're the leader of the Guardians of the Past," he said. It wasn't a question. Victor nodded. "Very perceptive, Detective. We've been searching for the heart of silver for decades, and now, thanks to you, we finally have it within reach." Emily clutched the device in her hand. "What exactly is it? What does it do?" Victor chuckled softly. "Oh, my dear, it does everything. The heart of silver is the key to rewriting reality itself. Imagine the power to change the past, to alter the course of history." "It's too dangerous," the detective argued. "No one should have that power." "Dangerous," Victor repeated. "Or the greatest opportunity humanity has ever had. Think about it. We could prevent wars, save lives, create a better world." Emily felt a pang of doubt. But who decides what to change? Who has the right to play God? Victor took a step closer. People with vision, with the knowledge and wisdom to make the right choices. People like us. Detective Thompson shook his head. "No, my grandfather and Robert hid it for a reason. Power corrupts, and absolute power like this—" "Your grandfather was a coward," Victor spat, his friendly facade disappearing. "He had the chance to change the world, and he wasted it." Suddenly, voices and the sound of breaking branches were heard. The Guardians of the Past were approaching. "Time for talk is over," Victor said, his voice cold. "Hand over the device and the heart of silver." "Now." Emily looked at the detective, then at the sphere on the altar, and finally at the device in her hand. In that moment, she made a decision. With a quick movement, she activated the device and brought it close to the heart of silver. There was a blinding flash of light, and the sphere began to vibrate and emit a high-pitched hum. "No!" Victor shouted, lunging towards them. But it was too late. The light intensified until the entire clearing was enveloped in a white glow. Emily felt as if she was being torn from reality itself, her body feeling as light as a feather. The last thing she saw before everything vanished was Detective Thompson's face, a mixture of fear and determination in his eyes. And then, the world around them disappeared in a burst of light and sound. Emily opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the bright sunlight. She found herself lying on the sand of a beach, waves breaking gently near her feet. For a moment, she thought it had all been a strange and vivid dream. But then she noticed something was different. The beach seemed more pristine, less developed. There were no buildings in sight, just sand dunes and coastal vegetation. "Detective Thompson," she called out, sitting up. There was no response. Confused and a little scared, Emily stood up and looked around. That's when she saw it, the lighthouse. But it wasn't the abandoned and deteriorated lighthouse she knew. This lighthouse stood proud and freshly painted, its light rotating even in broad daylight. "Oh my God," Emily murmured, realization hitting her like a wave. It worked. The heart of silver. It sent us to the past. Before she could fully process what was happening, she heard the sound of hooves approaching. She turned to see a rider coming towards her. For a moment, her heart leaped, thinking it might be thunder, but she quickly realized it was a different horse. The rider stopped near her and dismounted. It was a young man, dressed in a military uniform that Emily recognized from old photographs. It was a World War II uniform. "Miss, are you all right?" the man asked, approaching with concern. "It's dangerous to be on the beach in these times." Emily stared at him, unable to speak for a moment because in front of her, young and vibrant, was Detective Thompson's grandfather. He was identical to the photograph they had found in the box. "I'm a little lost," she finally managed to say. The young soldier smiled kindly. "I'm Lieutenant Jack Thompson. Allow me to escort you to a safe place." Emily nodded, still stunned. As they walked towards the horse, her mind was working at full speed. Somehow she had been transported to the past, right in the middle of the war, and now she was face to face with the man whose mystery had triggered this whole adventure. "Lieutenant Thompson," Emily said, deciding to take a risk, "have you heard of something called Operation Silver?" The young Jack stopped in his tracks, looking at her with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "How do you know about that?" he asked in a low voice, looking around as if fearing someone might be listening. Emily realized she had made a mistake. Revealing her knowledge of the future could alter the course of events in unpredictable ways. She quickly tried to think of an excuse. I heard some men talking about it in town," she lied, hoping her nervousness wouldn't give her away. Jack studied her for a moment before relaxing slightly. "You should be careful about what you hear and repeat, miss. These are dangerous times." They started walking again, this time in tense silence. Emily knew she had to find a way to return to her time, but she also felt the temptation to warn Jack about future events. Could she prevent his disappearance? Would that change the course of history? As they walked, Emily noticed they were heading towards a small military complex near the lighthouse. Several soldiers were coming and going, carrying boxes and documents. "Lieutenant Thompson," said an authoritative voice. An older man, clearly a superior officer, approached them. "Who is this civilian?" "I found her on the beach, sir," Jack responded. She seemed disoriented. The officer looked at Emily with suspicion. "This is a restricted area. We'll have to interrogate her." Emily's heart raced. If they interrogated her, they would quickly discover that her story made no sense. She needed a distraction, something that would give her time to think of a plan. As if answering her thoughts, a familiar neigh was heard in the distance. Emily turned, incredulous, to see Thunder galloping along the beach towards them. "Thunder!" she exclaimed, forgetting for a moment where and when she was. The horse stopped beside her, neighing softly. The soldiers looked at the scene in amazement. "You know this horse?" the officer asked, confused. Emily stroked Thunder's neck, trying to process how her faithful companion had managed to follow her through time. It's my horse," she said finally. Jack looked at Thunder with admiration. "It's a magnificent animal. I've never seen a horse like this around here." The superior officer seemed about to say something else when suddenly an explosion was heard in the distance. They all turned to see a column of smoke rising from the other side of the island. "We're under attack," someone shouted. Chaos broke out in the military complex. Soldiers ran in all directions, preparing to defend the island. Amidst the confusion, Emily saw her opportunity. She quickly mounted Thunder and leaned down to extend a hand to Jack. "Come with me," she shouted above the noise. "I can take you to a safe place." Jack hesitated for a moment, looking towards the smoke and then back at Emily. Finally, he took her hand and mounted behind her. Thunder galloped away from the military complex, heading towards the interior of the island. Emily knew she had to find the place where they had activated the Heart of Silver. It was her only hope of returning to her time. As they rode, Emily couldn't help but wonder if she was doing the right thing by taking Jack away from the danger. Was she changing the course of history? And what would happen if she couldn't return to her own time? The sound of more explosions echoed behind them, and Emily urged Thunder to go even faster. The fate of two different eras now rested in her hands, and she knew that the decisions she made in the next few hours could change the course of history forever. Thunder galloped swiftly through the dense vegetation of the island, carrying Emily and Jack towards the interior. The noise of the battle gradually faded, replaced by the sound of the horse's heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves under his hooves. Emily guided Thunder instinctively, trusting that the horse would remember the way to the clearing where they had found the Heart of Silver in the future. Jack held onto her waist, clearly confused by the unfolding events. "Who are you really?" Jack finally asked, raising his voice to be heard over the wind. "And how did you know about Operation Silver?" Emily hesitated. She knew that revealing the truth could have catastrophic consequences, but she also felt she owed some kind of explanation to the man who, in the future, would be Detective Thompson's grandfather. "It's complicated," she finally responded. "But I promise you, I'm here to help. There are things that are going to happen, and I need to make sure everything turns out right." Jack remained silent for a moment, processing her words. "There's something strange about you," he said finally. "Your clothes, the way you talk. It's as if you're not from here." Before Emily could respond, Thunder stopped abruptly. They had reached the clearing. The stone altar was there just as she remembered it, but there were no signs of the Heart of Silver. "What is this place?" Jack asked as they dismounted. Emily approached the altar, examining it carefully. It will be the place where something very important is kept," she responded distractedly. Jack watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. "You have to tell me what's going on," he insisted. "We're in the middle of a war and suddenly you appear knowing things you shouldn't know." Emily turned to look at him, aware that she was at a crossroads. What she said or did next could change the course of history. She took a deep breath and decided to take the risk. "Jack," she began, "this is going to sound incredible, but I come from the future, from the year 2024 to be exact." Jack stared at her, incredulous. "That's impossible," he said finally. "I know," Emily replied, "but it's the truth. In my time, your grandson and I discovered something called the Heart of Silver. It's an artifact that can alter time and reality itself. We accidentally activated it and it sent me here to your time." Jack seemed to be struggling to process this information. My grandson," he repeated. Emily nodded. "Yes, he's a detective, like you will be after the war. We were investigating your disappearance." Jack's eyes widened. "My disappearance? In my time, you mysteriously disappeared during the war." "No one knew what happened to you," Emily explained. "But now I think I understand. This moment is when you disappear." Jack sat heavily on a nearby rock, his face pale. "This is too much to take in," he muttered. Emily knelt in front of him. "I know it's a lot, but I need your help. We have to find the Heart of Silver and make sure it's safe. It's too dangerous to fall into the wrong hands." Jack looked at her, and Emily could see the internal struggle in his eyes. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I believe you," he said. "I don't know why, but I believe you. What do you need me to do?" At that moment, the sound of breaking branches was heard nearby. They both jumped to their feet, alert. "They found us," Jack whispered, instinctively reaching for his weapon. Emily looked around desperately, searching for an exit or a place to hide. It was then that she noticed something glowing faintly between the cracks of the stone altar. "Look!" she exclaimed in a low voice, pointing towards the glow. They approached the altar, and carefully Jack moved one of the stones. There, hidden in a small hollow, was the Heart of Silver. "It's beautiful," Jack murmured, extending his hand towards it. "Wait," Emily said, stopping his hand. "We don't know what might happen if we touch it directly." The footsteps were getting closer. They didn't have much time. "What do we do?" Jack asked, looking nervously towards the trees. Emily made a quick decision. She took out the device they had found on the future beach from her pocket. Miraculously, she still had it, and brought it close to the Heart of Silver. "Whatever happens," she said, looking Jack in the eyes, "remember that you have a grandson who admires you and who needs to know the truth about what happened here." Jack nodded, a steely determination in his gaze. "I'll remember," he promised. Emily activated the device. A blinding light emanated from the Heart of Silver, enveloping the entire clearing. Emily felt as if she was being torn from reality again. The last thing she saw before everything vanished was Jack's face, a mixture of wonder and resolution in his eyes. And then, once again, the world around them disappeared in a burst of light and sound. Emily opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the bright light. She found herself lying on the sand of a familiar beach, the sound of waves breaking gently in her ears. For a moment, she feared she had returned to the past again, but then she noticed the modern buildings in the distance and the restored lighthouse. "Emily!" she heard a familiar voice calling her. She sat up to see Detective Thompson running towards her, with Thunder trotting beside him. Relief flooded her at seeing that both were safe. "Detective! Thunder!" she exclaimed, standing up unsteadily. The detective reached her, his face a mixture of concern and relief. "Are you okay? What happened?" One moment we were on the island with Victor, and the next, I appeared here on the beach. Emily looked around, trying to orient herself. I think we're back to our time. Then, remembering her experience, she added, Detective, I saw your grandfather. I was in the past, during the war. Detective Thompson's eyes widened. What? How is that possible? Emily quickly told him about her experience in the past, her encounter with the young Jack and how they had found the heart of silver. The detective listened attentively, his expression changing from disbelief to amazement. So my grandfather knew about the future. About me? Emily nodded. I told him he had a grandson who admired him and who needed to know the truth. Detective Thompson was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then, as if remembering something, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a yellowed envelope. When I appeared here, he said, this was in my pocket, it wasn't there before. Emily took the envelope with trembling hands. On the front, written in elegant handwriting, it said, For my grandson Jack. The detective carefully opened the envelope and took out a letter. He began to read aloud. Dear grandson, if you're reading this, it means that Emily managed to return to her time and that the events she described to me have unfolded as they were meant to. I want you to know that I didn't disappear. I made the conscious decision to go into hiding to protect the secret of the heart of silver. It's a power too great and dangerous to fall into the wrong hands. After my encounter with Emily, I understood the importance of my role in history. I worked in secret with a small trusted group to ensure that the heart of silver and its technology were never misused. I'm sorry I couldn't be part of your life, but I want you to know that I was always proud of you, even before I knew you. The heart of silver is safe, hidden where only those with the purest intentions can find it. I trust that you and Emily will know what to do when the time comes. With love, your grandfather, Jack Thompson. The detective finished reading, his voice breaking with emotion. Emily put a hand on his shoulder, moved by the revelation. He didn't disappear, the detective said quietly. He sacrificed himself to protect the world. Emily nodded. And now it's up to us to continue his legacy. At that moment, thunder neighed softly, as if in agreement. Emily stroked him, grateful for her faithful companion's constant presence throughout this adventure. What do we do now? The detective asked, looking towards the horizon. Emily followed his gaze, aware that their adventure was far from over. I think it's time we find the heart of silver, she said, and this time we'll make sure it's protected forever. Detective Thompson nodded, a new determination in his eyes. Together, he said, extending his hand. Emily took it, sealing their commitment. Together, she confirmed. As the sun began to set over Seaside Beach, Emily, Detective Thompson, and Thunder prepared for their next mission. They knew that the Guardians of the Past, led by Victor Blackwood, wouldn't give up in their search for the heart of silver. The race against time and danger was just beginning. End of story.